The first one was a whisper of a line. A thread of ruby drawn just below my left wrist. I found it while washing my hands. The soap stinging it into a brief, sharp awareness. It was thin and unnervingly straight, about an inch long. Looking for all the world like a paper cut. Though I couldn't recall handling any paper sharp enough to draw blood. I'm an architect. My days are spent with software and smooth-edged rulers. My hands stained with graphite, not blood. I dabbed it with a tissue, blamed it on a moment of carelessness I'd already forgotten, and thought no more of it. The second one appeared 3 days later, on the soft skin of my inner forearm. This one was longer, perfectly perpendicular to the first, forming a neat right angle. Again, the sting of shower water was its herald. I stood there, water sluicing over my shoulders, and stared at the new mark. It was identical in character to the first, a clean, surgical line. Too precise for an accidental scratch. My cat, a languid ball of fluff named Mort, had never so much as extended a claw in my direction. I checked my desk, the edges of my drafting table, the door frames, nothing. I felt a prickle of unease, a dissonance in the ordered reality of my life, but I smothered it with logic. I must be scratching myself in my sleep stress. I'd been working on the new municipal library proposal, a behemoth of a project that had me mainlining coffee and sleeping in 4-hour bursts. Yes, that had to be it. The third and fourth lines arrived together a week later, branching off a second in parallel. Now it looked less like a random collection of scratches and more like a deliberate diagram. An incomplete rectangle was now etched into my arm, a blood-red schematic. I found myself touching it compulsively. The skin around it smooth and unblemished. The lines themselves healing into faint, silvery scars. They didn't itch or ache, they just were. My sleep became a guarded, suspicious state. I started wearing long-sleeved pajamas, tucking my hands under the pillow. I even tried wearing soft cotton gloves to bed, feeling utterly ridiculous as I did so. Yet, the marks continued to appear. A short, diagonal slash on my right shoulder blade, discovered with a pain hiss as I stretched one morning. A pair of converging lines on my left calf, like the corner of a rune drawn in scar tissue. The horror was a slow-boiling thing. It began not with a scream, but with a quiet, creeping sense of violation. My body, my own sovereign territory, was being marked by an unseen hand. The comforting solitude of my apartment began to feel different. The familiar groans of the old building, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant moan of city traffic, they all seemed to harbor a new, watchful quality. I'd be sketching at my desk, the only sound the soft scratch of my pencil on vellum, and I'd feel a sudden, intense chill, as if a window had been thrown open in the dead of winter. But the windows were always sealed, the air still and heavy. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I'd be jolted awake by a sound. It was a faint, dry scratching. I'd lie motionless, straining my ears, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. It sounded like it was coming from inside the walls a mouse, I'd tell myself, a rat. But the sound was too rhythmic, too methodical. It was the sound of a nail being dragged, slowly and deliberately, across wood. Then it would stop, and the silence that rushed in to fill the void was somehow worse, thick with anticipation. I started documenting the scars. Each morning, after a tense, full-body scan in the bathroom mirror, I would photograph any new additions. Then, with the precision of my profession, I would transcribe them onto a large sheet of parchment paper I taped to my wall. I used a fine-tipped red pen, replicating each line, each angle, each intersection. Slowly, painstakingly, a pattern began to emerge. It was a floor plan. There were rooms, corridors, strange, asymmetric spaces. It wasn't a building I recognized. It was complex, labyrinthine, with dead-end hallways and chambers that connected in illogical ways. The map was growing, spreading across my skin like a pale, insidious vine. Scars appeared on my ribs, my thighs, my back. I became a walking blueprint. My work began to suffer. I stared at the schematics for the library, and my eyes would lose focus, the clean, logical lines blurring into the maddening, impossible geometry etched onto my own flesh. My boss, a kind but pragmatic man named Henderson, called me into his office. He spoke of deadlines and client feedback, but his eyes were full of a different kind of concern. "Alex," he said, leaning forward, "you look like hell. You're pale, you've lost weight, everything all right at home?" I wanted to tell him. I wanted to pull up my sleeves and show him the map, to ask him if he recognized the architecture. But how could I? Someone is breaking into my apartment at night and drawing a map on my body with a scalpel. The words sounded insane even in my own head. "Just tired," I mumbled. "Big project." He nodded, but he wasn't convinced. "Take a few days off rest. See a doctor." I did see a doctor, dear. Evans was a pleasant woman in her 50s with a calming demeanor. I presented her with my most benign, easily reached scar the original set on my forearm. "I keep getting these strange cuts," I said, trying to sound casual. "I think I might be scratching myself in my sleep." She examined them, her touch professional and cool. "They're very clean cuts, precise. You're sure you're not injuring yourself during the day and forgetting?" "I'm sure." She ran a gloved finger along one of the silvery lines. "Dermatographia can sometimes cause raised wells from minor scratches, but these are actual incisions. And you say you don't feel them when they happen?" "I just find them in the morning." She prescribed a mild sedative to help me sleep more deeply and suggested I set up a camera in my room if I was truly concerned. "It's most likely parasomnia," she concluded. "Stress-induced, your mind is anxious about your project, so your body is acting out in a creative way." The camera was my next logical step. I bought a small, motion-activated night vision camera and set it up on my bookshelf, aimed at my bed. The first night, I barely slept, hyper-aware of the tiny, blinking red light in the corner. In the morning, I rushed to my laptop, my hands trembling as I plugged in the memory card. There was a new scar, a long, elegant curve that traced the line on my collarbone. I scrolled through the footage. It was hours of grainy, black and white stillness. There was me, a pale shape under the sheets, tossing and turning. The timestamp clicked forward, 2:47 a.m. 2:40 a.m. At 2:49 a.m., I sat bolt upright in bed. My eyes were wide open, but they were vacant, glassy. It was a chilling sight, like looking at a stranger wearing my face. My movements were stiff, unnatural. I watched, my blood turning to ice, as my right hand rose. My fingers were rigid, the nail on my index finger somehow looking sharper, longer in the monochrome footage. I watched as my own hand descended to my collarbone and drew a slow, deliberate line across my skin. I didn't flinch. My face remained a blank mask. There was no blood in the infrared video, but I could almost feel the phantom sting, the parting of the flesh. After a few seconds, my hand dropped. I lay back down and was still. A wave of nausea and a strange, hollow relief washed over me. Deeper, Evans was right. It was me. I was doing this to myself. The horror was internal, a product of my own fractured mind. It was terrifying, but it was an explanation. It was something I could, perhaps, fix. But the relief was short-lived. As I continued to watch the footage, a detail caught my eye. Just before I sat up, at 2 hours 48 minutes and 30 seconds, the air in the room seemed to ripple. It was a subtle distortion in the grainy image, a heat haze shimmer near the foot of my bed. It lasted only a second, but it was there. I replayed it a dozen times. A flicker, a brief warping of space. Then, as I lay back down, it happened again, a similar shimmer near the door. And then there was the sound. I had forgotten to check the audio. I plugged in my headphones and replayed the moment I caught myself. Behind the faint rustle of the sheets, there was another noise. It was quiet, so quiet I had to crank the volume to maximum, but it was unmistakably there. It wasn't the scratching from the walls. It was a low, guttural whisper. It was a single word, spoken in a voice that was both dry and wet, like autumn leaves being crushed underfoot. Closer. I ripped the headphones off, a strangled cry escaping my lips. My heart hammered against my ribs. It wasn't my voice, it was something else. Something in the room with me. The next few weeks were a descent. I taped my fingers at night. But new marks would appear in places I couldn't possibly reach a perfect. Small squared in the center of my back. A line that snaked from my shoulder blade to my spine. The map on the parchment paper grew, becoming a sprawling, terrifyingly detailed architectural drawing. It now covered not just my torso and limbs, but was beginning to creep up my neck. The phenomena in the apartment intensified. The cold spots were now biting, arctic pockets of air that would materialize and vanish in seconds. Shadows in the corner of my vision would seem to stretch and writhe when I wasn't looking directly at them. The whispering started to happen even when I was awake. It was never clear, always on the edge of hearing. A sibilant murmur that would slither into my thoughts and vanish when I tried to focus on it. Soon, it would hiss, almost there. My friend Liam, an art historian, came over unannounced one evening. I had been ignoring his calls. He took one look at me and the wild, obsessive energy in my apartment. The drawn curtains, the parchment on the wall, the scattered books on esoteric architecture and medical anomalies, and his face fell. "Alex, what the hell is going on?" he asked, his voice gentle. For the second time, the urge to confess was overwhelming. This time, I gave in. My voice was hoarse, cracking with a mixture of fear and desperation as I told him everything. The scars, the sleepwalking, the camera, the voice. I finished by pointing a trembling finger at the massive drawing on the wall. "It's a map, Liam, a blueprint, and it's almost finished." He looked from my frantic face to the drawing. He stepped closer, his brow furrowed in concentration. He was an art historian. His eyes were trained to see patterns, to find meaning in symbols. "This is incredible," he breathed, his voice a mixture of awe and concern. "The precision of it, but Alex, it's not a floor plan." "What are you talking about?" "Of course it is. Look, there are rooms, corridors." "No," he said, shaking his head, "the scale is wrong. The connections are impossible for a physical structure. This isn't a building for people to walk through. This is more like a circuit diagram or a pathway, a sequence." He traced one of the lines with his finger. "This is a guide, Alex. It's meant to show a path from one point to another." He fell silent, his eyes scanning the entire drawing. Then he pointed to my chest. There's a space here, in the center of the drawing. It's still blank, the destination. I hadn't thought of it that way. I had been so obsessed with what the map was that I hadn't considered what it was for. A guide, a pathway. A chill, deeper than any I had felt before, settled into my bones. A guide for what? That night, the final mark appeared. I was jolted from a shallow, feverish sleep not by a sound, but by a feeling. It was a searing, agonizing pain in the center of my chest, as if a hot needle was being driven into my sternum. I screamed, clutching at myself, and the pain vanished as quickly as it had come. Shaking, I stumbled to the bathroom. There, in the starlight, I saw it. Directly over my sternum, in the blank space Liam had pointed to, was a small, perfectly rendered X. It was darker than the other scars, an angry, visceral red. The map was complete. I stood there, staring at my reflection. The man in the mirror was a hollow-eyed stranger, his body a canvas of strange hieroglyphs. The map, the guide, a path from one point to another. And the X over my heart was the destination. X marks the spot. A sudden, horrifying clarity washed over me. It was a revelation so sickening it buckled my knees. I leaned against the sink, gasping for air, my mind reeling as all the pieces clicked into place with a series of devastating, internal snaps. The scratching sound not from the walls of my apartment. I had been a fool. The acoustics of my own body, the way sound travels through bone and fluid. I pressed my ear to my own chest, and I heard it. Faint, but there, a dry, scraping sound. It was coming from inside me. The cold spots, not pockets of air in the room. They were internal, cold dread, yes, but something more. The localized chill of something alien moving deep within my tissues, a presence that leached warmth. The voice, the whisper, it hadn't been in the room. It had been in my head, but not from my mind. It was the telepathic murmur of a passenger. My childhood, a detail I hadn't thought of in years, a story my mother used to tell with a shudder. I was born with a teratoma, a monstrous tumor, a lump of flesh and bone and hair near my spine. The doctors had called it a vanishing twin, a parasitic sibling that had been absorbed in the womb. It had been surgically removed when I was an infant. A benign, dead thing, or so they had thought. My sleepwalking, I wasn't scratching myself. My body was being puppeteered. Commandeered. The entity inside me, the thing that had been dormant for decades, had woken up. It couldn't see the outside. It was trapped in the darkness of my body. It needed a map. My own hands, guided by this internal navigator, had been meticulously etching the blueprint of its prison onto the prison walls. I looked from my wild-eyed reflection to the parchment paper in the other room, then back to my body. Liam was wrong, and he was right. It wasn't a floor plan of a house, it was a floor plan. With trembling hands, I pulled up an anatomical chart on my phone. An anterior view of the human torso. The rib cage, the organs, my breath hitched. I held the phone up next to my reflection. The long, straight lines on my ribs weren't corridors. They were the paths between my ribs. The strange, asymmetric chambers weren't rooms. They were the lobes of my lungs. The shape of my liver. The curve of my spleen. The diagonal slash on my shoulder was the route past the clavicle. The converging lines on my calf charted a course along the tibia. It was a map of me. A perfect, 1:1 scale anatomical chart carved onto my own skin, an escape plan. And the X over my sternum, the weakest point in the ribcage, wasn't the destination. It was the exit, closer, the voice had whispered. It was getting closer to the surface. Soon, it had hissed, almost there. I stared at the eggs, mesmerized by the sheer, cosmic horror of it. All this time, I thought something was trying to get in. I thought my mind was the thing being invaded. But the invasion had happened before I was even born. This was not an invasion, this was an escape. A new sensation began, deep beneath the eggs. It wasn't a pain, it was a pressure, a deliberate, rhythmic pushing. I watched, frozen in terror, as the skin over my sternum began to bulge slightly, in time with the pressure. Push, relax, like someone testing a locked door. The scratching sound inside my chest was louder now, more frantic. It was accompanied by a wet, clicking noise. The sound of something unfolding, something getting ready. I backed away from the mirror, my legs shaking uncontrollably. I couldn't scream. The sound was trapped in my throat, strangled by a terror so profound it was physical. My gaze was locked on the X on my chest. The skin there was stretched taut, turning white around the dark red mark. A thin, dark line appeared down the center of the X. It wasn't a cut from the outside, it was a split from the inside. A single drop of dark blood welled up and trickled down my chest. The pressure stopped, the scratching stopped. An absolute, profound silence descended, both within me and without. The world seemed to hold its breath. Then, I felt a final, decisive movement, a sharp, internal lurch. The skin over my sternum tore open with a sound like wet fabric ripping. It wasn't a gush of blood, it was a clean, deliberate parting. Through the new, dark opening in my own body, I saw a flicker of movement. Something pale and segmented, like a fungal growth or a bleached insect leg, shifted in the glistening darkness within. I stood there, a living door, a map that had fulfilled its purpose. And from the new, wet darkness in the center of my chest, something looked out at the world for the very first time.